Obviously, you've heard a lot about the fact that these data releases are happening right now. And in the past year, they've obviously had to think about how they're actually going to release this data into the wild, right? Or for public sort of consumption. So what we're going to hear about now from the panelists is what were the issues and what were sort of the lessons learned so far in how to make this data available? What are the challenges and sort of thoughts about where they started with, what was the assumptions that they actually had to start with in terms of releasing data, and how that evolved. I know that there was a lot of discussion from the prior open house last year and trying to get data out there. Subsequently, we are now sort of at the point where the grand challenges are releasing the data, but there's actually a lot of different approaches in how this data has been released. So with that, again, I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves when they come up to talk. They're just going to give a sort of brief introduction or a quick overview of what their thinking is in terms of the data governance, the challenges there. And we'll actually have more of a discussion with all of you and sort of get your questions, sort of your thoughts on this and so forth. Okay, so with that in mind, let's get started.
I'm Hortense Gallois. I'm part of Bridge2AI voice ethics team. And my coworker and friend Alex Garnier is here with me to present the work we've been doing supporting the release of the Bridge2AI voice dataset, focusing on the ethical and legal aspects. So first, I want to give you a brief overview of the approach that we took in determining what was the best approach to release the Bridge2AI voice dataset with this idea of balancing the utility of the data with the privacy challenges. And I'm going to talk about some challenges that we encountered in that process. So the process that we used was, first of all, to look at what was the data we were trying to release. So we went through all the variables, and based on their sensitivity or the risk for identification, we classified them in a 3-tiered approach, and removing, of course, all the high-risk direct identifier. So I'll come back to the 3-tiered approach in a moment, but that was our starting point, thinking, oh, with that data set, we can do this model. The second step was to look at the technical environment and the protective measures that are in place. Then we set up all the contractual and terms and conditions to access the data based on the tier and the level of risk. And for the control, we set up a data access committee to review the application, which I'll detail also in a second. And the future challenge that is coming for us is determining sustainability. So I know it's something that was discussed in the F2F in the previous panels, but that's really the challenge that's coming for us. But another challenge that has been the main challenge that's been guiding the past few months for us has been to determine what do we do with raw voice sample, because it is really the heart of the data set and is what makes the data set so special. So we really want to find a way to share it in a way that is the most useful and accessible, but also being concerned and mindful of all the privacy challenges, because unlike genetic data or other type of data, voice is very new in the sense of its potential for re-identification, but also for clinical information. So this is those challenges that made us really consider what do we do with voice data, and it was quite new. So there's not a lot of literature. And also when you look at the law is not planned when it was adopted. HIPAA did not plan for the potential of using voice for biomarker and for all of that. So voice is not even clearly determined under a US law. So one of the challenges we had is, as Yael presented, under HIPAA, voice is not directly classified as a protected health information, but voice prints are part of the biometric information in the list of 18 direct identifiers that need to be removed in order to share a data set. So that was a big challenge. What is a voice print, and is a raw voice data, is it a voice print? So this has been the talk for many, many hours, and a lot of research and a lot of expertise that came into that question, and really came to this answer that it does not amount to a raw voice sample does not amount to a voice print. So that's the basis upon which we decided to share the data with all the technical measure necessary to share it safely, but we knew that we had this in the background. So I was mentioning a 3-tiered approach. So for the open access data, I invite you to go to our website, because I think you can see much on this, but it's basically all the aggregated data anonymous demographic information, and this is, as I said, accessible to anyone. Then we set up the registered access that Alex presented in detail yesterday. And in this tier, we included data that had low to minimal risk of participant identification, and we included voice spectrograms. And for that tier, the basis is that we verify the identity of the person as accessing the data, and we also make them commit through a light touch contract to commit to the responsible use of the information. And the upcoming data release, the control data, which includes the raw voice data. For this release, we set up additional layers of protection, meaning that we set up a system in which the contractual agreement is with the university of the data user. So it's a strict DUA with terms and conditions. And also we set up data access committee that's going to be reviewing the application one by one in order to determine if the person is apt to receive the data and use it in a way that is fair. So in practice, as I said, a lot of challenges. I'm actually happy that Yael didn't have her minute to present because that's what I'm going to be talking about. So the first question that we had was, after we released the registered data, someone came to us being like, your data set's amazing, but I don't understand why you don't share raw voice data, because with voice spectrograms, we can reconstruct the voice data anyway. And to that, we replied, well, actually, you can't, because you can reconstruct a voice, but it's not a voice that is similar enough to the original sample that were at risk. And also, in order to do that, you need to have a level of expertise that is pretty high, and based on the common rule, you need to consider the technical difficulty for re-identification in the equation. So we're pretty safe with saying, okay, I think we're fine sharing that data. You can reconstruct, sure, but it is not a risk in a sense that you will still not be having the raw voice sample. But the other thing that was really interesting with that example is that 2 years ago, we were talking about all this, and we were really thinking voice spectrograms, that's not a risk because you can't reconstruct unless you're Satra. Nobody can do that. And 2 years later, yes, you can. So that was also showing how fast it's moving in this field and how we need to be very anticipatory. The second issue that came up was we were just about to release, and someone at Visionet, the platform that's going to be releasing control data, mentioned the fact that, wait a second, voice HIP identifier. And to that we had, okay, we're ready, we've planned for this. And so we had a memo that was put together to explain all the ethical justification that came into deciding that this is the approach that we're taking. And we're very confident in the fact that we've put together all the technical, organizational, legal, ethical measures that we need in order to share that safely. So this is where we are now, many more challenges to come. And this has been such a tremendous interdisciplinary effort. So yeah, that's what I have.
Start by with a quote from a paper a couple of years ago in ACM Communications. So where Jarahi et al. Say the lack of attention to data excellence and quality of data has resulted in underwhelming outcomes for many AI systems. Now, when we're talking about data excellence and quality of data, as was brought out yesterday by the advisory panel, we're also talking about the metadata. We absolutely have to talk about the metadata. And so that the metadata plus the data is an integrated unit. And based on that, I would like to make a statement that data governance is really a holistic activity. And you heard from our colleague here about how they handle protecting confidentiality, and it's in multiple layers and multiple stages. But I would say it extends from acquiring the data through release of AI-ready data, and it requires characterizing the metadata in a very deep way across the data lifecycle. In our case, from the point where you acquire the sample and process it in the lab and get a readout from an instrument through a complex pipeline through many stages. So the metadata has to fully characterize the data sets, including the provenance of the data, the semantics, the statistics. I would say the provenance has to include the software, access to the software that was used to process the data, and other properties to produce what's called in the literature pre-model explainability. Pre-model explainability is really the heart of AI readiness, okay? We hear a lot about deep learning AI models being black boxes, and that you have to have some kind of post hoc interpretation of how they arrived at their conclusions, but you cannot allow the preparation of the data to be a black box either, right? So the metadata has to assure people who are building models and people who are using those models that the data are reliable, responsibly acquired, well-governed, and explainable. And to do that, we have built a tool set that is used to prepare all our data releases, and it's being improved all the time. You'll see an improvement on the June data release. We've extended the data sheet concept of Gebru 2021's paper, which was really a kind of a starting point for a lot of people, where she said that you have to have a characterization of your data sets that's like the characterization you get for an electronic component or something else that you're going to use in building some machinery, because you have to know what it's good for, what you can't use it for, what are its technical specs, and all the rest of it. We've extended that to include, at this point, all but one, and we're adding the last one this next month, all but one of the AI readiness characteristics that are outlined in the Bridge2AI AI readiness for biomedical data paper that we prepared in collaboration with the Bridge Center Standards Group, really prepared, right? So this is a figure from that paper, and what we're saying here is that all of these aspects, this is sort of the karmic wheel of data preparation or data pre-model explainability, that all of these criteria have to be handled: fairness, provenance, deep characterization of the data, the semantics, the statistics, potential sources of bias, data quality, the ethics, the sustainability, the computability all have to be handled. And sorry, I go back. And one of the things that you'll see when in the June data release is the data sheets are actually interactive, and you can interrogate the provenance graph, so you can see it graphically. You can interrogate each stage in the process, all the intermediate data sets. You can link to the software that was used to prepare the data and so forth. So we think that's really important, and we recently received a supplement from NIH to work with other GCs on applying this to provide a kind of a common model for metadata preparation in the program. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone, and congratulations for those of you who have made it to day 3. So the Salutogenesis program, its data governance structure is quite simple in the sense that there are 2 data sets out of one. One of these data sets, which is the NF500 accesses that we have so far, is this publicly available data set, which contains, for the most part, kind of the large portion of our data, that 2 terabytes. So this is the survey data. These are really like the critical, I think, one of the critical pieces to salutogenesis, given its focus on becoming and remaining healthy, which is questionnaires on mental health data, social determinants of health, and then clinical measurements, retinal images, blood and urine, electrocardiograms, physical activity levels and heart rates, blood sugar levels, home air quality, temperature, and humidity. Then we have our restricted data set. So this is the unrestricted data set plus either HIPAA controlled or otherwise sensitive information that could be used in the re-identification of participants. So this includes zip code, genetic sequences, genotyping information, medications, race and ethnicity, sex, past health records, and motor vehicle accident reports. And so the way that that AI Ready, the Salutogenesis project, has decided to take our data release is to use what is referred to as a Swiss cheese model. Someone I know who's much more into cheese than I am noted that it's actually an Montpellier. But this is a very common kind of analogy that became extremely prominent during the COVID pandemic of how to understand risk and risk reduction, which is that rather than having single points of failure for our risk reduction, we have multiple layered points of risk reduction so that no one point of failure for a particular risk is doing all the work to make sure that we're protecting participants, researchers, the NIH, and the projects at large. So 4 layers primarily are used to protect patient privacy or participant privacy. The first is that downloading the data requires an identity verified login. You then sign a license agreement, and then you provide an attestation as to the use cases that are permitted and not permitted for the data. The data is then also watermarked for the purposes of your use. And this is regardless of whether you're using the restricted or the unrestricted data sets, and they are subject to 2 different licenses. One is a data use agreement, and then the DTUA, which covers our restricted data set. So this is our governance measure, and we'll talk more about some of the other things that go on in the ethics panel, but our kind of governance measures and what we think are best practices have really stuck to this model of what can we use to plausibly re-identify, or in the words of one of our data collection experts, to pseudo re-identify. So you can actually probabilistically re-identify people using data versus what is general purpose data that is not at a high risk for re-identification that anyone can use, but still have to go through this process in order to download the 2 terabytes of data and get to work. So this is a photo of how you would go about that if you wanted to jump on. So you would sign up, you would log in, and then you would go about a training module that would induct you into what the purpose of the data is, how it is used. You would give some overview as to research purposes. You would sign a license, you would select your data, and then you would submit. And depending on whether you were applying for the unrestricted or the restricted data set, you would then either be given access to the data based on your attestation, or you would go to the Data Access Committee for further review as to your use cases. And then if everything is on the up and up, you would be given access to the restricted data set. Oh, that's Chorus. Thank you so much.
And last but not least, we'll hear from Chorus.
Hello, I'm Barbara Evans. I'm at the Law School and Engineering School at University of Florida, and I'm working with the Chorus Clinical Care Grand Challenge. And I want to talk about the decision each of the challenges is making about how to make data available. There's the question of whether the data should just be freely downloadable or in a trusted research environment. If you're the way I am, I like to do my work by downloading every information resource I need onto a laptop and getting completely off grid, either by the creek at my family's ranch or up in a long airplane ride up in the real clouds rather than the research clouds, and be left alone to think. And so having to be tethered to some sort of IT system, I don't like as well. But with the data that the clinical care challenge is dealing with, we need to realize this is real people's clinical records and data. And under our system of law, there's only one person who has a right of access to that data, and that is the patient themselves. None of the rest of us have a right of access to people's data. And that's true even if we're doing wonderful work aimed at saving lives. It's a privilege to access people's clinical data, and it needs to be done very responsibly. And all of the data in our project is subject to the US federal medical privacy regulation known as HIPAA. And that's actually a rather stringent privacy regulation, and it allows state laws to put additional requirements and institutions, individual healthcare institutions, to put their own policies on top of that. And we have multiple sites contributing data. The goal was to get data sets that are really representative of all of the United States. And so we're dealing with a lot of state laws and institutional policies in addition to HIPAA. HIPAA lets you get data for 23 specific uses without seeking an authorization, which is HIPAA's word for consent. And there's a well-known issue that in medical data, if you ask for consent, that can lead to unrepresentative data sets. There's a consenter's bias. So the choice was made to take advantage of those pathways in the HIPAA regulation for accessing data to get a set without authorization to avoid that non-representativeness that can occur. And each of those pathways under HIPAA was designed based on longstanding, traditional, hundreds of years old ethical uses of medical data. So they weren't just taken out of the air. This is a longstanding ethical tradition reflected in these. And taking advantage of those pathways means that they come with rules, that you have to do some validation of who's getting the data, what the data is being used for, which is to say it requires a governance framework. And to responsibly make data available means complying with all of that. So we're taking that very seriously as we design our governance structure. I also want to note on this chart, as AI is evolving, the threats are evolving. And that means that AI can be used for immense good, but we also know it has potential to be used for ill. And so the law is in a process now of evolving as new threats emerge, new laws emerge. So this notion of a trusted data environment means that there's enough control to be nimble and respond to these new requirements as they emerge. And just to give an example here, we are in a phase right now, and it's been driven by the advent of AI, where the law of data protection is changing. The Common Rule, which is the major US research regulation, and the HIPAA privacy rule, which is our major medical privacy regulation, basically are grounded in the 1970s and concepts of how you protect data then. And the notion was rights-based privacy protections. If you get consent and people consent to a data use, then it was their choice. The way things are moving, and we see this in a new regulation that's just out from the Department of Justice, duty-based privacy protections, that it's the duty of the person using and sharing the data to keep the data safe. And that's true even if people have consented to a use, their duties in handling data. There's also a change underway. In the past, there was great valence on whether data were identifiable or de-identified. And I think there's a growing recognition that in the current data environment, everything ultimately is identifiable. And this new regulation is protecting bulk data, large samples of data, whether or not they've been anonymized or encrypted. It all needs to be protected. Also, there's an increasing awareness of group harms. In the past, we had privacy laws that just protect the individual whose data are being used. But there's a growing recognition that if you use data from people who consented, those data can be used to draw inferences about other people and can affect groups and societies. So you need to protect data for that. And there's also a shift from in-house enforcement of the Common Rule and the HIPAA privacy rule at the US Department of Human Services to a more centralized Department of Justice enforcement framework. So as the laws have evolved, custodians of data will have to keep evolving in this changing environment to make sure they're providing the most active and best ethical and privacy protection against a changing standard that's going to continue to change. And these are considerations that sort of counseled that for this clinical data that the Chorus project is dealing with, a trusted research environment offered the best way for ethical and privacy compliance. And thank you very much. I will hand it back to you, Alex.
Thanks, Barbara. Okay, so I'm going to ask the panelists to comment on what they felt, given now that the Grand Challenge has been running for about 2.5 years, right? And you all started 2.5 years ago with a certain amount of thinking about how you were going to share your data. Obviously, that thinking has evolved. So in thinking about the lessons learned so far, for each project or each panelist, for that matter, you can all have different statements. What would you have wanted to know 2.5 years ago in starting to think about, if I had to start the project today and think about how we're going to do data governance? What was the assumption that you made wrong back then, or none? But what would you want someone to know now today? So we're just going to go down the line, starting with voice. Turn on the mic. No, button.
There we go.
Yeah.
It's a really, really big question.
Here.
Okay, thank you. I'm not used to that. Another thing I've learned, but I think that's what it is. Like everything has been learning by trial and tribulation and just like dealing with, I feel like we couldn't have known even if, so I think the process was right in a way, like we had to go through it to learn it because unlike genetics. Oh, sorry.
Get to your mouth, please.
Ooh, okay. Yeah, I feel like unlike genetic data again, like this is a field where we don't have a lot of literature. So it's been like really learning from the ground and seeing what happens and learning from that. So
One quick thing I would add to that is the importance of basically cross-functional collaboration across technical, scientific, legal policy teams, starting really, really, really early and getting incredibly immersed in each other's way of thinking, in the sense that policy people make incredibly wrong-headed assumptions about how technology and science work all the time. And, coming from a science background, the law can seem, and, policy ethics can seem incredibly arcane, and building those relationships of trust, mutual collaboration, really, really, really early in the process is important. I think it's not an uncommon experience for a 3-4 year DGP to spend 2.5 years just getting comfortable collaborating together and then starting to be able to do meaningful governance near the end of the life of the project. That's a common occurrence, and everybody at the end says, boy, we should have done this better at the start. And then a few years later, you're in a new consortium, bunch of new friends, you're getting to know each other, and you have the same exact experience. So I think learning how to do that at the outset is really important.
Yeah, along similar lines, I wish we had more time to think through things. I don't think we knew when the project started how rushed the project was going to go and the breakneck speed that we had to make decisions at. The other thing that I didn't realize was how often I would have to call the state attorney general's office. We've had to consult them many times throughout the lifespan of this project, as the laws, as Barbara alluded to, have been changing. There's been significant changes since the start of this project, and I never thought I'd have to talk to the state attorney general's office as many times as I did.
Right. Well, I think on a slightly different note, or again, on the holistic side of data governance, I think this is a program to develop AI-ready data. And I think it would have been really smart of us to develop the definition of AI readiness at the outset. Very smart. It took us a while to get the standards working group around to that idea and to realize how important it was that we did not have a common model of AI readiness. And I think that's really important. And it includes all these ethical aspects and data protection and all the rest of it, but it also includes the deep metadata that we need to have.
what I've learned is that this is like all other important ventures, and that you never have all the information you need at the outset, and you just have to stay really, really nimble. If you're doing something that matters, it's going to be that way, and this is no exception. So I sort of learned again that you always have to stay nimble. The laws are going to change, the technology is going to change, and you just got to run like crazy to keep up with it. And that's the nature of what we're doing here.
So I joined AI Ready 6 months ago. And so if you asked me what we should have done 2.5 years ago, I'd be like, hire me first. But in getting up to speed, I interviewed all of the milestone leads on AI Ready. Now I'm not going to go into exactly what everyone said because it wasn't research. There was no IRB. This was conversations. But two of the things that I think reflect what's been said so far is that there were attempts to engage different communities about what data governance meant, that because of the pace of the program, were not able to be fulfilled in the ways that some people wanted it to, and were not able to access those communities. And I think that increasingly that's going to become important, especially, for example, as the care data principles migrate out of the indigenous communities, not just of the United States, but around the world, and into other communities, both of who have experienced marginalization, but just find care a more plausible form of data governance than fair. And that's going to become a contest that will need to be resolved at the level of programs. The other thing that I found is that the US has had grand challenges around data and the life sciences writ large, clinical care, microbiology, things like that, for at least 15, close to 20, actually 30 years, right? LC comes from the Human Genome Project. Data governance has been tried many, many times. And in my conversations with people were shocked to find that there were things that they could learn from the NSF SynBerg program, from all of us, from the Precision Medicine Initiative, from the Human Genome Project itself. And I think having a historical view of what governance looks like would allow people to start not from square one every time, and actually kind of have a footing on which to move from. You don't have to stay the same, but not have to kind of reinvent those wheels constantly.
Great. Are there questions from the audience? We've got mics back there. Can someone grab a mic? Or you can yell really, really loud. Go ahead.
Dave Wilson, I am Vice President of Health Research.
Oh.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Dave Wilson, Vice President for Health Research, Professor and Chair, Department of Indigenous Health at the University of North Dakota. I'm glad you brought up the care principles at the very beginning. One of the things that we all know is AI ML is here to stay. And I think it's really important in these early stages moving forward that you think about including those populations like Indigenous communities, because I didn't hear anything about recognizing sovereignty, learning from historical unethical uses. The HIPAA and Common Rule are far inadequate in terms of providing those protections. So please continue thinking about that as you move forward, because these are the communities, along with rural communities, that really need this based on capacity and infrastructure limitations across the country.
Thank you. I wish to note that we didn't address this in this panel because we have an ethics pillar panel that's coming up where that work will be discussed. There have been a lot of efforts at outreach to these communities and how to incorporate their views. And Michael Young and Eric Rosenthal will be on that panel, and we'll be discussing it in more detail. So it was just here we allocated topics among the panels, and I regret that didn't get into this panel.
Just maybe, go ahead. Just one really quick follow-up comment on that is that this is an issue we think about and face a lot in the Canadian context, where there's a lot of research either specifically directed to Indigenous populations or where you're doing, let's say you're doing serology or you're doing epi research, and you have a lot of Indigenous participants in your, population cohort. So you have basically, you need to think about Indigenous governance, even when you're not doing research that specifically relates to Indigenous populations. And there's been a big push to try and integrate that kind of governance into, the traditional regulation of research, both in things like, downstream data access committees, things like that, and in having meaningful stakeholder representation on ethics committees. I think two of the, the major challenges that we face in the Canadian context is building, enough trust to meaningfully integrate those stakeholders in actually building out and carrying out, their own communities' governance over their data. When we had a lot of the big COVID databases that were being spun up during the pandemic, there was a big push to fund those sorts of databases. And a lot of Indigenous communities ultimately stepped away from just, having Indigenous cohorts at all because of, very legitimate perceptions that it was basically helicopter science. And in dialoguing with the First Nation Information Governance Council in Canada, there was a big discussion about how to do meaningful engagement with communities where you don't have one community that's affected by your research. You would really want to be consulting with a large number of different affected communities. And one pathway that we at least tried to spin out was to have researchers meaningfully demonstrate that they carried out those obligations to consult prior to being allowed to access data where the variables they were looking at related to Indigenous communities. But I think there's a lot more room to have crosstalk between stakeholders from Indigenous communities and the sort of traditional science institutions we think about what kinds of mechanisms would be satisfactory in actually carrying out this governance in an applied, not just performative or not just one and done sort of way.
Office, and I led this COVID-19 response to the NIH department.
I would love to.
Very successful.
I would love to chat.
And
One,
he's been involved with the Bridge to AI. Do you have something to add, Joe?
Yeah, and I'd said this over the last couple of days. A lot of it, people have been touting public and private partnerships. And for me, like if you guys know, Regeneron just bought the 23andMe database, and they've been scooping up data from Latin America because Latin American Indigenous people are not protected, right? So it's the model, it's the commercial model of driving intervention and implementation to those populations that we purport to help, right? And that's not going to happen in the current model. It's just not. And so for Indigenous people, at least in the United States and Canada, they do have laws protecting themselves, right? And so Cherokee Nation came out with a machine learning and AI law back in March, and more tribes are going to follow suit. So in addition to the state laws and local governance, tribes are stepping up. Canada has a slightly better system because it's already been instantiated in law to take the research dollars and separate them from the rest of Canada just for Indigenous people. It's not a perfect system, but the United States has nothing like that. It's all done with a handshake and a smile. So there's nothing to compel people to behave well. And I just wanted to say that I've worked with Dave, worked with the National Congress of American Indians. There's like now 11 policies about data and machine learning, especially in the digital space, as data travels from place to place. If it's Indigenous data on the internet, it still belongs to the tribe. And then we've worked with 39 tribes in Ontario to pass a similar machine learning and AI data laws to protect their data. We've did that where I'm from, Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe. We've passed one there. It's not as fully fleshed out as the Cherokee Nation one, but we're working on that. And then Native Bio and about 6 other institutions have been tasked by the NIH to create a national tribal data repository. Now, all this to say is that more people are going to realize, so like you call them stakeholders, some people are rights holders, not stakeholders. So more groups are going to realize this problem of implementation and intervention, right? If you don't have the right insurance, you don't have the right market share, you're not going to get served. So in the African American community, a lot of that is being done through historically Black colleges and universities, especially the religious ones, because they can claim the intellectual property over their data. And so they make sure that their NIH funding or their federal funding is below the threshold so that they can claim it, and the rest of their money is private donations. So all that to say, and I don't know what you guys think about it, but this is going to be more and more contentious as we go forward.
Thanks a lot for bringing that up, Joe. So one of the spaces that I've worked in previously is around access and benefit sharing of genetic sequences in, sorry, genetic sequences in non-human organisms, especially at the international level, and the use of property claims by international organizations, other nations, indigenous communities is a way of staking out rights under our current framework. And I think that one of the things that we can learn historically from the Human Genome Project at the NIH onwards is that there was a very explicit decision made during the Human Genome Project to separate governance and ethics, where ethics would address downstream issues and governance would start from the top. And one of the things that these data principles are challenging is whether that should be the way that we do things, or if governance and ethics are actually unified at the top and have to become a decision and a set of conversations that we have from the very, very start. But as was said by some of the other panelists, that means that time and resources have to be allocated at the start to have those conversations, because as I will say during the ethics lessons learned panel, you cannot start a project twice.